Microsoft just gave us new Xbox numbers, sorta. It's a magical day in the world of public companies because today Microsoft released their fiscal earnings for the last quarter. Actually, they released their annual earnings because it was the end of their fiscal year. But the TLDR of their last quarter earnings is that they blew it out of the water. Microsoft crushed its goals by, it brought in 47% more net income than in previous years. But today we are here to talk about Xbox because Xbox was a topic of conversation and numbers were a little bit interesting. And Microsoft gave us some information and they completely avoided other topics. And so let's just dive into what Microsoft has and talked about during its earnings call and in its financial releases. Specifically, during the earnings call, Satya Nadella, he said, "We are all in on games. The Xbox Series S and X are our fastest selling consoles ever, with more consoles sold life to date than any previous generation." Now, this is an interesting little stat here because there's a couple things that we know are going on. First off, we don't actually have any Xbox sales figures. They refuse to release these. Obviously, they know how many consoles they've sold, but they're not willing to tell us. But we know that it's selling faster than the Xbox One and faster than the Xbox 360 and faster than the Xbox. Honestly, that's not all that surprising considering Microsoft's two-pronged strategy of having the most powerful console and the most affordable console of this generation. That's a pretty big deal in itself. But I think the thing that's most interesting is that, hey, there's a massive console shortage still going on because of chip supplies. I did a video previously where Phil Spencer even talked about how getting Ethernet ports is challenging. So the fact that the consoles are the fastest selling, even with supply constraints, means that they're selling pretty quickly. Now, somebody's going to say, how is this possible? If you can't buy a console, how is it the fastest selling console? Well, here's how it works at a high level. Microsoft obviously ordered more consoles up through, we'll just say June 30th, than they did any previous generation. And this was prior to the pandemic that these orders were placed. They got these consoles and every single one sold. Now, they may even potentially got less than they had ordered. We don't quite know because, again, Microsoft doesn't share the numbers. But we do know that every single unit that is hitting a store shelf is selling extremely quickly, and that is just generally good news for Microsoft. Also, based on the earnings call from Amy Hood, she very specifically said it looks like it's going to be the constraints on the supply are going to be pushing through the next quarter as well. Not all that surprising, but again, if you're thinking that next quarter supply is going to magically start appearing on shelves, it doesn't look like that based on what things we've heard from Phil Spencer, and now we're hearing from Amy Hood, who is the CFO over at Microsoft. Now, Microsoft did say that Xbox Game Pass subscriptions did grow year over year. Year over year is not all that surprising, but unfortunately, they didn't give us any numbers. So Game Pass subscription grew, but actually the overall Xbox org service revenue was down. Now, let me explain why. It was down about 4%, and Microsoft very specifically called out they called out that it was a third-party game basically sell-ins. Let's just cut through the mud. It's because Fortnite was not selling as many subscriptions or additional in-purchase content, if you will, or whatever, just bonus items, new skins, this quarter as it did previous year. Makes sort of sense, right? We were just sort of in that front load of the pandemic and people were buying a lot of Fortnite stuff. That's just kind of the reality of it. And Microsoft says that really hurt things at a top level. But on the individual console hardware sales, Microsoft said Xbox hardware revenue grew 172% year over year. Again, not surprisingly, because last year at this time, you could only buy an Xbox One. And why would you buy an Xbox One at the very end of a generation? And now every single console Microsoft is building for its current generation is selling through as quickly as it hits retail shelves. So the TLDR here is overall Xbox org revenue dropped, but it dropped because Fortnite wasn't selling as many skins or whatever, subscriptions, battle passes, whatever you want to call it. But hardware revenue was up. Also, Game Pass subscriptions, which is Microsoft's most critical rating factor as they judge themselves for the Xbox health, is up as well. So that is good news. Now, Microsoft did provide some official guidance for the quarter ahead, meaning next quarter. They fully expect gaming revenue next quarter to grow in the low double digits, meaning at least 10%. And they also expect Xbox content and services revenue to grow in the low single digits as well, meaning top level for the overall org is going to grow, and then hardware is going to continue to grow along with services and revenue. So the outlook for Microsoft is actually genuinely pretty optimistic about where things are headed. Now, they didn't talk too much about the details of Game Pass, but they know that they have Big titles launching. Flight Sim quite literally just launched today. If you're watching this, you can go out and grab that. And they've got a bunch of titles leading up through the holiday season, which Microsoft believes is going to help boost their Game Pass subscription revenue at the end of the day. So that is a good thing for the Xbox org as they continue to grow. Satya Nadella just basically saying we are all in on games is a very big deal. Now that the Xbox org is routinely passing $10 billion in annual sales, it's really reached a new level inside the Xbox org about where it lives. LinkedIn actually, I believe this last quarter finally passed that benchmark as well. For those who have been hanging around the world of as Microsoft as long as I have, it used to be that a $1 billion, a business wasn't worthwhile until it was worth $1 billion. A business wasn't worth $1 billion. We don't care about it. Now it seems that new benchmark is about 10 billion, which is crazy to think about, that if you want to spin something up or acquire something, it needs to be feeding into that $10 billion machine. Otherwise, it's just maybe not worth Microsoft's time. But at the end of the day, Xbox appears to be very much worth their time. So is it a good quarter? Was it a bad quarter? I think generally speaking, it was a good quarter for Microsoft. Yes, the drop in revenue is obviously not what Microsoft wants, but with the fact that they could not make that revenue up because they couldn't get more consoles onto store shelves, it's not that bad of it's not really a bad quarter for Microsoft, I think, from Team Xbox. Overall, the fact that hardware was up so much, the fact that the CEO is so optimistic about Xbox, that's sort of the even though revenue was down, the fact that the CEO is saying we're all in and we've got the fastest selling consoles ever, and we're seeing small and modest growth in our Game Pass subscribers, and we're dropping big games, is a pretty big deal. So what should we be looking for next? Well, now we're a couple weeks into Q3. The next quarter is going to be starting to see that ramp up into the holiday season. We're also entering into the back to the school time, which is where you would see things like PC sales, potentially console sales, as your children head off to college, provided they're going to be in person this year. Going back to college and doing all that stuff, typically people will buy consoles, Game Pass subscriptions to get ready for the holiday shopping season. So there should be expected growth, which is probably why Amy Hood is expecting low double-digit growth for the next quarter. Things we can also be looking for that might be early indicators is keep an eye on supply. I have a very good feel about when certain retailers are getting supply in. If we start seeing larger shipments of consoles coming in, that could very much help boost Microsoft's overall objective. The challenge will continue to be the supply shortage. Now, not just Microsoft is obviously feeling this. We actually started to see this quarter that Apple is starting to feel the pinch, and some of the larger suppliers in the industry are really starting to get squeezed by the supply. Now, you might be wondering, we've been hearing about this for so long. Well, we've been hearing about it for so many months, but these orders are backlogged, and many years, well, not many years might be overselling it, but a lot of the larger companies plan out so far ahead that it wasn't really up until now that the squeeze started to impact them on a financial basis, which is what we really started to see this quarter from Microsoft, from Intel, from Apple, and many others. So there we go, folks. Those are the numbers, and that's what Microsoft announced pretty deep down into their everything from the earnings call to their filings. And so as we learn more about what Microsoft is doing in the world of Game Pass and everything else, make sure to keep it subscribed here, because the only BS on this channel is me.